Maximize cloud efficiency with Doit, the trusted partner in multi-cloud management for thousands of companies worldwide. Visit doit.com. That's DOIT.com. Do it, your cloud simplified.
Packet pushers.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Packet Protector, the podcast at the intersection of networking and security. I'm Jennifer Manella here with Drew Conry-Murray, and today on Packet Protector, we're looking at cloud firewall architectures. And if you've deployed firewalls in the campus or data center, it's really good to know that there are differences and what that looks like in the public cloud. So we're going to dive into what do you need to know with our guests. And today we're going to have Jeff Loughridge and Amir Tabdili, both from Konekti Systems, and they specialize in helping clients deploy and operate firewalls in the public cloud. So Jeff, Amir, you guys specialize in cloud firewalls. What does that even mean to those of us on the networking side?
Thanks for having us. This is Amir Tabdili with Konekti. There's a lot of confusion actually about what cloud firewalls really mean, and I think it's a good place to start trying to clarify that. To us, for the purpose of this conversation, cloud firewall is an entity that actually looks inside the packet. So in the cloud, like in the public cloud, which is what we're talking about here, like in AWS, for example, there are many services that actually maybe look at the packet metadata, they look at patterns, they look at things like IDS and IPS. But what we're talking about here actually is an entity that actually is in the data path and looks into the IP packet. Now, is that a layer 3, layer 4? It could be any others. It could be from all the way from layer 3 to layer 7. And the form that it comes in could be an appliance, or it could be an appliance, but it's offered as a service and you just don't see what's underneath the hood.
So for a little context, I think probably most or all of us have heard the notion of taking what were traditionally on-prem appliances that started off as hardware, maybe were turned into virtual appliances, and then now they have versions of those that are living up in AWS and Azure. Is there something fundamentally different from when we talk about cloud firewalls? Is that one piece of it? Is that the whole piece of it? What does kind of the ecosystem look like from a technology standpoint?
Yes, I mean, that's one piece of it. So one piece of it is basically software versions of the kind of devices that people are used to in the data centers. So somebody has a virtual machine that, for example, is a Palo Alto firewall, and they deploy that in the public cloud. That's a piece of it. But then there's also network cloud firewalls that are offered by the cloud providers themselves, right? So these are developed, for example, by AWS. You don't see what's underneath the hood. You don't see, for example, the actual appliance doesn't appear in your console, but you can easily insert these devices into your data path and inspect the packets. So software variants of what's in the data center is a big part of this. So companies like Palo Alto and Fortinet have these things, as an example, that you can go and buy, and then you have to basically do the plumbing and insert them into your environment. But then there is also software as a service versions of these that are offered by other third parties and also by the cloud providers themselves.
So I could get a firewall from AWS, for example, or Azure or Google, whatever, as opposed to my traditional on-prem firewall vendor.
Exactly.
So in prepping for this call, the idea came up that network firewalls in the cloud are an anti-pattern, or they might be. What do you mean by that?
I think some would make that argument. If you can get away with security groups, NACLs, packet filters, WAF, I say go for it. I joke around with our clients that the best firewall is no firewall. Management of firewalls definitely has an operational drag on the org, but in many cases, they are an absolute requirement. They're not an optional element.
Okay, that's interesting to hear from a company that specializes in cloud firewalls. Say, if you can get away with a firewall without having a firewall, do it. Why would you say that?
If you have an app, let's say it's not a web app and it's just listening on a single port, maybe if you lock down tightly with security groups, you don't need a firewall. I don't want to make the argument that companies' requirements should be a certain way. If they don't need a firewall, then they don't need a firewall.
Okay, depending on the app and the environment, you could get away with simple access control lists or packet filtering, et cetera.
If done rigorously, yes.
Right, and the rigor is the key.
One example would be a lot of folks don't lock down outbound in the security group. That's a pretty important thing. If VM or container only needs to talk to, let's say, Ubuntu distribution mirror, then lock it down to that. Don't leave it wide open.
So how does the cloud differentiate from the data center with respect to firewall deployment, aside from the fact that it's in the cloud as opposed to it's in my data center and I can touch it?
The cloud is different fundamentally the way these things are deployed. A lot of it has to do with the fact that cloud networking is very different than what people are used to or what you see in a data center. And the way the cloud networking influences the feature set these firewalls offer is not very, very obvious at the very beginning when you decide to do this. So how is cloud different? To start, the networking is different. The actual operation of it is going to also be different. The feature set you need is different, for example, as well, because a lot of the times people have applications in the cloud that have a lot of east-west traffic, for example. They need to make sure that the networking constructs that are underneath these firewalls actually support that you can actually build things that are actually very supportive of east-west traffic pattern and inspection of those traffic by a firewall. The other things that are really important in the cloud are, for example, compliance in the cloud is a little different. People have compliance requirements in the cloud that might be different. As for example, encryption, right? End-to-end encryption, we've seen customers of ours that say that encryption cannot be broken all the way. We've seen people that actually say with an AWS VPC, that's a private, and we can actually stop the encryption there. And that affects how you deploy the architecture that you actually use for the firewalls.
Are there other things to think about? I guess I'm thinking like L2 is going to be an issue on the data center, but maybe not in the cloud where everything's L3 IP based.
Sure. So that kind of goes back to the way the networking is different, right? So for example, because of that lack of L2, what happens is that a lot of these redundancy features or HA features that these vendors have given folks in the data centers. So for example, people are used to deploying these boxes in an active passive or active active using sort of proprietary HA configuration. Almost all the time people use this. And what happens is that these firewalls basically mirror their sessions from the active to the passive, for example. And when a failure happens, the sessions are actually pre-replicated in the second device. However, this in cloud is different because a lot of this doesn't work across AZs, for example. You cannot have this kind of proprietary HA to work. So then you have to come up with something else, which I guess we'll get into a little later, but there are methods in the cloud to implement the same kind of HA, but it does not involve a session replication, for example. So you lose feature set, you gain some things, but you lose a lot of the functionality you had in the data center.
So there are things that I would expect to happen in an on-prem deployment that I may still want that capability, but I'm going to do it a different way in the public cloud.
Exactly. HA is a perfect example of that. You will get HA, but the way applications react in the case of failure is different. So for example, in a data center, if there's a failure in your firewall, it's possible that your application might not notice. But in the cloud, because the sessions are not replicated, you still have HA, meaning that you will fail over to a second firewall. The load balancers adjust to the second firewall, but the sessions are replicated, which means a lot of times applications might not notice that. So somebody actually might have to, if it's a web application, they might have to go hit the button again, hit the return button again and reload their web browser, for example. So the way applications are impacted is very much about the cloud is different because the underlying networking constructs are not the same.
Let's talk about deployments. Obviously, you've got the public cloud, you've got the public internet. You want to have some kind of separation between the two. Let's start with there. I know VPC is essentially an Amazon concept, but I feel like all the cloud providers have a similar mechanism. So we'll just use VPC in the generic term, but I've got my VPC. Where is my firewall going?
As with many things in IT, the answer is it depends. In many cases, clients want to protect any traffic going off cloud. So internet bound traffic, on-prem bound traffic. In other cases, our clients want to protect subnet to subnet traffic. So inside of VPC, they want to inspect that traffic. So it really varies based on requirements.
What are some typical deployments then?
Imagine you're a data center and branches, and you want to wire those into your cloud presence. You may want to plop a firewall as like a intermediate device between those two segments and then inspect all traffic going in and out of your cloud presence.
It sounds like it's almost like a enclave deployment model where you'd put this thing just like we would on-prem in front of a group of cloud assets or resources.
Sure, that's one way to do it.
Okay.
So one thing to add to that is that if you look at the architecture that people follow, there's two big camps. One is a distributed architecture and one is a centralized architecture. When you're protecting your internet-bound traffic, every time we look at this stuff, we have to differentiate between what is the requirement. It's north-south to internet or from the internet, and then is there an east-west requirement or not? Yeah. For each one of these, depending on which one of these requirements you're sticking with, how you do this is different. But the fact that you want it centralized or distributed is always a big question to answer. And by that, what I mean is that in the cloud, it's very possible that your application VPCs, VNets, have their own internet access points, right? So it's not like data center where there's one place to exit internet. You might actually have 100 VPCs, and because developers might just provision this themselves or through a VPC vending machine, and they might get an internet access point. The main question that needs to be answered is that how do you want to protect this? Do you want to protect this in a distributed fashion, or do you want to have a centralized place where this inspection happens? So for internet traffic, a lot of times you can actually bring the traffic back to a centralized place. So you can actually have a set of firewalls there per region, for example, that does the inspection. Or you can actually have one of these per VPC if you wanted to. But the centralized design is the one that scales better management-wise. So a lot of people go towards that direction.
And I had a question around managing because I know, one of the things we struggle with on-prem has been centrally managing all of the random firewalls we might have in the environment because we were using this vendor and now we're using that vendor and we've got their big firewalls at these locations and then the little ones out here. Is it easier in the cloud? Like, can we centralize the management of these things, or do we have similar challenges to what we would have if like traditional on-prem technologies where we have kind of per vendor management tools and nothing that crosses the streams, if you will?
There are different parts of management, right? And I would say making things standard management-wise is one of the primary goals of our customers. So when you talk to them, especially if that multi-cloud, which we'll get to, one of the main things is how do we make things similar across clouds and across environments, across data center and the cloud, so we can manage it easier? And that's not easy, right? If you're a customer that already has a data center deployment of firewalls, then if you want to use the same management service, you probably are going to get pushed into using the same vendor's appliance in the cloud, right? Which means that, for example, in the case of Palo Alto, for example, you can use Panorama to manage everything. Now, if you actually went with the cloud provider service, your management in the data center side would be different than what you do in the cloud, but then you will be able to take advantage of what AWS offers you as far as a management tool. There's other advantages to that, for example, integration to your IAC pipeline and all that, but there is no single management tool that covers everybody. And I also think there are different aspects of management, right? So for example, configuration of these things across clouds can be done using the same kind of scripting probably, but at the plumbing of the networking piece of it is going to be very different than data center and across clouds. So going back to what you said and summarizing it, no, there is not a single way of doing the management. You could get the feature set and the configuration consistent by having the same appliance everywhere. That's what I would say.
We're just waiting for the magic product to come out that just sprinkles its fairy dust across all of our firewalls,
Right.
physical and virtual, and manage them all in one place. Okay.
But one of the things that you could do is that, for example, there are services within the cloud that can be used to aggregate your alerts, for example, from different firewalls. So in the case of AWS, there's a service called Security Hub, and Security Hub is an alert aggregation service. All these different firewall vendors and the native AWS, and they have actually, I think they also have an integration with the Azure firewall where they can send their alerts to the same place.
Okay. That's helpful, at least for monitoring.
So there are tools like that the cloud provider offers that can be used. But again, to me, management has many aspects, and the alerts and the logs are one aspect of it, which is easier to deal with probably, while the configuration and the network plumbing part of it is more complicated.
How do things like availability zones and regions affect cloud firewall deployment, or do they?
The best practice is to include a firewall in every availability zone. This not only helps with availability, but it helps eliminate cross-zone traffic charges because the charges are different for cross-zone data throughput. For multi-regional designs, you have to make a decision around inspection centralization, which Amir addressed earlier. Do you want to centralize firewalls? Do you want to centralize all ingress egress? There's not really one size fits all for any of this, but generally you do want to kind of distribute firewalls over availability zones. And for multi-region, things get a little more complex. You have to make some decisions there about centralization.
And once you decide that you're going to have firewalls in different AZs, like we talked earlier, then you end up with this issue of how we do HA, right? How do we fail over from one firewall to another in the case of failure? And that's where a lot of these architectures that have been developed, and some of them are done by the vendors, and some of them are variations of that. We've done some of those that were our own creation of variations of what the vendors had recommended for specific requirements. But these reference architectures, let's call them, have mostly about how do we do HA in the cloud without having the ability to do the proprietary HA thing that we are used to in the data centers. As soon as you go across AZs, you have to deal with that. So for example, there's something called a sandwich architecture, which basically has a cloud load balancer on the outside of the firewalls and one on the inside. And that architecture basically has one firewall in each AZ. And since you cannot replicate the sessions across, what the firewall does is when one dies, it basically load balances in a stateless manner across the two firewalls. There's a lot of bells and whistles to this, but in summary, that all happens because we decided to go across AZs. That redundancy requirement kind of forced us to go with that kind of architecture.
It sounds like there's a lot of extra knobs and considerations here. Now, I know you're a little bit biased just because of the work you guys do in the company you're with. Well, not with, but own. Do you find that organizations tackle this themselves? Do the engineers that were managing regular firewalls before take over this? Do security teams swoop in and take over this? Or cloud teams coming in? And Who's doing this inside of organizations, and are they doing it, or are they outsourcing it?
We have the utmost respect for developers. We do see, though, that a lot of times, typically smaller companies with no security team with developers will try to do it themselves, and they'll struggle a bit and have to call outside help. That is a very common pattern that we see. For teams that have existing security teams, things look a little bit different. If they have existing security knowledge of firewalls, the configuration stuff kind of transports or can move into the cloud space, because configuring a Palo Alto or Fortinet is the same in data center or cloud. It's the design piece that is the most difficult piece to pick up, because just the way that networking works in the cloud and the way that you piece together these different components is not something that's intuitive.
The design sounds like it's a significant challenge because of availability zones, load balancing, HA, that kind of stuff.
And how quickly do things change? So many of the rest of the infrastructure vendors that have pushed pieces of their management or monitoring or any of the configuration component to the cloud. One of the things I think, engineers are dealing with and architects are dealing with is that can change pretty rapidly. So whereas we're used to kind of set and forget until whatever the next audit or review cycle is there potential for these things to change on the back end in between those periods?
Yes, definitely. Since we started our company in 2017, we've seen drastic changes. The designs at your disposal for firewall insertion in 2017 look nothing like the options today. You have many more knobs and ways to put firewalls in data path than you did back in 2017.
And the firewall vendors themselves have added features for this purpose, right? So cloud used to be an afterthought as far as the feature set that is available on firewalls. But for example, when AWS introduced Gateway Load Balancer, which it basically takes advantage of this tunneling protocol called Geneve, then Palo Alto had to go and implement whatever knobs are required to be able to understand that tunneling format and be able to process the packets. And then a bunch of other features that were just after that were related, for example. So yes, they're changing all the time, especially with appliances of traditional firewall vendors like Palo Alto and Fortinet and Juniper and Cisco. Those firewalls were not meant for cloud, right? Especially for public cloud. So when the first instances of deployment of these in the public cloud were very kludgy. The designs that were required to put them in there put a lot of load on the operational knowledge of what you needed to know underneath the hood, and made it really complicated. As time has gone by, it's become easier. I wouldn't say it's still perfect. There's a lot of issues, but they're constantly adding new features.
So I think this ties into the discussion we've been having about management. Is there value in having consistency among my firewall vendors across my on-prem and in my cloud? I.e. that if I'm already using vendor A on-prem, it just makes sense to use vendor A in the cloud, or I need to look at feature sets, capabilities, and my design to decide, yeah, it looks like for my cloud deployments, maybe I want to go with cloud native, like the firewall from AWS, Azure, Google, et cetera.
It depends on your security requirements to start. If you had to compare what's available as far as feature set on these appliances coming from traditional vendors versus what's available by what CSP gives you as a native service, the feature set is way more developed. There are many features, security features that you have.
You mean the traditional firewall vendors have a more developed feature set? Yeah.
Right. So the first question is, do you need those, right? Because if you need them, then that answers your question. Then you have to do it based, right? So there are questions on what kind of applications do you have in the cloud? Are these just a simple web applications? Do you have stuff that requires some complex processing? What are your encryption, decryption requirements? There are all kinds of things you have to consider, and also the performance pricing. But I would say the first thing that starts is, what feature set do I need based on what I have? The second thing is, what do my people know? Right? My engineers and operational people, do they have some cloud knowledge? Can I bring them up to speed? Can I train them? Because the services that the cloud providers give you are very integrated with the rest of their offerings. So you kind of have to understand cloud quite a little bit, right? You need to understand this kind of, if there's a problem, how do you troubleshoot it? So I would say you have to make a choice at some point. If you're in data center, if you're not in a data center, that decision is much easier, right? So there's three variations I see. There's one the people are in data center and in one cloud. There are people that are just in one cloud, and then there are people that are multiple clouds, which then they have to answer a different question. What is the minimum security feature I can live with that is offered by different cloud providers? Because we actually have a customer that is a really large customer that are trying to put the same service in GCP, Azure, and AWS. And they're trying to figure out what's a minimum set of features that the cloud providers, for example, provide. There's a lot of things that you have to consider to make that decision.
It almost sounds like the same challenges we have with applications and security on mobile devices like phones, because it's like, you know what you want to do. Like, let's say it's enforce a screen lock and a password, right, for a MDM policy. But the options for doing that on Apple are not exactly the same as the options for doing that on Android. So it's almost impossible to have the same exact policy. And for that reason, people tend to manage, this part of their fleet with Intune and that part of their fleet with Jamf or something else. And then you end up with, so it sounds like it's a little bit of the same challenge.
It's definitely analogous in the cloud. We do see a lot of orgs chasing that standardization across cloud, but that does limit the design patterns you can use because very few of these design patterns are portable across CSPs. Whenever these organizations are seeking standardization, I always have to worry about, are we in a situation where you're picking kind of lowest common denominator features? We definitely want to avoid that.
How about visibility? Are firewalls providing visibility for engineers to understand things like traffic composition and so on?
In the cloud, if you are decrypting traffic on a firewall, that definitely gives you additional visibility since everything these days is HTTPS. Without a firewall device doing that decryption, you're kind of blind as to what traffic is going in and out of your cloud infrastructure. The firewalls do give you more visibility into that.
Is there any relationship or integration to the point that the firewall, whatever kind it is up in the cloud, would have access to the decryption keys to do that type of inspection for applications that might be hosted behind it? Or is that not any more integrated than it would be in traditional architectures?
I'm not aware of any integration that would give the certificate to the clients such that it's trusted by the firewall. I'm not aware of that.
Okay.
You mentioned alerting, I can get alerts even sent across multi-cloud environments to one location. What about logging? Because logs are going to be key for any firewall engineer, even a network engineer. How does that work with my public cloud firewalls?
Well, I mean, you can send your logs to a storage in the cloud if you want. What we do is a lot of times for compliance reason, we create a logging account that is separate from any other accounts that the customer has. That is very locked up. So in the cloud, you don't have this concept of different VLANs or different segments. What is really most of the time you just put them in different accounts. So you can send them to a different account. You can actually create endpoints in the cloud where the transfer between these entities happens in a smooth way. You could send them back to your data center, but it's going to cost you, right? Because you're going to have egress charges. So
Yep.
That's one of the things that you have to worry about, right? Also, the Palo Altos and the Fortinets and these guys also have cloud-based services that you can send the data to for analysis. These are services that you just basically send them to this as a service that they offer by subscription, and it's sitting in their infrastructure. This is not sitting on your infrastructure, but then you can use them. Again, there's expense to all of these. So there are many ways to do this, but I think what you had in mind was probably the case of an enterprise wants to keep their logs. Yeah. So what we would do is that basically create an infrastructure that is separate just for logs with very tight control and store them in the cloud.
Okay, so I can have log storage in the cloud, but let's say I'm willing to accept the charges of exporting these logs to my SIEM or whatever log analytics tool I've got on-prem. Is that something you see customers doing because they need to do that analysis? Or is it more like you should probably just run this service in the cloud?
Yes, we actually have a customer. This is an Azure customer that they have Palo Alto firewalls on-prem and a very big deployment, a lot of branches. And they were using the Azure native firewall in the cloud. So they were in Azure and they were using the native. And the project we're doing for them is actually moving them to a Palo Alto. Now, in this case, a Palo Alto is not the way we have been talking about it. The Palo Alto actually has a service offering in Azure where you can actually hide a lot of the plumbing, but underneath the hood is really a Palo Alto appliance that is doing the security for you. That's something that Azure and Palo Alto have come up together with a service that is a Palo Alto firewall, but it's done as a service in the cloud. So this is separate than a virtual machine you deploy yourself. But anyways,
Okay.
we are doing this service for them just for the purpose of them being able to do a unified analysis. And in this case, they're using ExpressRoute, basically a private peering to send the traffic back to their data center so that everything can be analyzed in the same place.
Okay, so it is possible if I need to get logs out of the cloud to on-prem infrastructure, I can do that. I'm probably just going to pay for it.
This just becomes a question of what is your connectivity back to your data center? Is it through an IPsec tunnel or do you have a direct connect, for example?
Speaking of export costs, are there other costs that I should be aware of in the cloud that might be different from the way I've, traditionally costed out on-prem firewalls?
Yeah, there's two different ways of doing licensing in the cloud for firewalls. One is the on-demand model where you're paying by a minute. That is extremely expensive. The other way is to engage directly with like a Fortinet or Palo Alto, buy a license, and then bring it to AWS. It's called BYOL. The second option is what most of our customers elect to do, since that is the more economic option.
What accounts for that expense of doing it on demand? Because isn't sort of the whole cloud model to be on demand?
Maximize cloud efficiency with Doit, the trusted partner in multi-cloud management for thousands of companies worldwide. Doit's innovative tools, expert insights, and smart technology make optimization simple. Elevate your cloud strategy and simplify your cloud spend. Visit doit.com. That's DOIT.com. Doit, your cloud simplified.
I guess we need to differentiate between the cost of the firewall license and the cost of the EC2 instance that sits underneath of it, right?
Right. Okay.
So if you're doing it truly on demand, which is what Jeff meant, then you just get one number. That's a combined dollar amount for your EC2, everything, the EC2 and the Palo Alto license, for example. And it's usually more expensive. Now, if you actually went down the route of getting a license from your vendor or from your reseller, what you end up with is, first of all, it's cheaper because you probably have some discount already negotiated for, and that's for a year. But then the EC2 part of it, you can actually use, a lot of money saving techniques like reserve the instance, etc., to make it cheaper. Then you have two separate costs. And if its firewall is on all the time, if the firewall doesn't need to be turned off, for example, right, then you have ways of making the EC2 cost much cheaper. And your license is also going to be cheaper because you're probably getting it for long term at the bulk, in addition to what you probably already were paying for that vendor.
And are there other costs that come associated with it? Like, obviously, I've got the license. Will I also be charged based on, the amount of traffic that firewall is processing in the public cloud, or is that included in the license?
So it depends, right? In the case of like something like a firewall that you're actually managing the actual appliance, like we've been talking about, you might have some features that have an extra cost. So
Sure.
like
Yep.
encryption, decryption might have something. But then there's also vendors out there that actually that are there and they've offered this functionality as a service. When you go to that, including the CSP provided services, right? We've been talking about the virtual machines from Palo Alto and Fortinet, but you also have Amazon and Azure firewalls, network firewalls. You have Palo Alto's as a service for Azure. You have all these variations. You have companies like Valtix, which is now Cisco, which we worked with in the past. With these guys, there's always based on the many dimensions, how they charge. And one of the dimensions could be traffic, how much traffic underlying virtual machines actually process.
On the CSP side, the CSPs are kind of like the mafia. They always get paid for data transfer. So you really can't avoid that.
That's good to know. Yes.
Oh, so many jokes there. They do always get their money for everything and then more. I did a cloud security training forever ago that Rich Mogul was doing at Black Hat. And I remember getting home. This was so long ago. I remember getting home and it took me, I don't know how long to figure out how to spin everything down in AWS because I was still getting, it wasn't expensive. It was like $4 or $8 a month at first. And then it was like, I'd figure out how to turn off certain things. And then I think I eventually got it down to 12 cents a month or something stupid. They will charge you for everything, won't they?
I have a bill that I get every month for like $29 or something. I don't even know what account it is, and I cannot find the account. So I finally gave up on it. It is very difficult.
So let's say a company decides it does need to protect cloud workloads with firewalls. What should they do to get started? How should they start approaching them?
The first thing that a company needs to do is look at their applications. What are the applications that are in the cloud? And what do these applications requirements are business-wise? And we're talking about things like encryption, decryption, source IP visibility, what kind of requirements does the app have, what ports need to be visible, et cetera. And then I would say the second thing we need to look at is how much of a cloud knowledge does a workforce have, right? We're architecting and then running and managing this once it's deployed. What we usually do is that we start with going through the spreadsheet of application requirements. And then we just basically make sure all the groups are there, because usually a lot of times there's not a single person who has all the answers. So we say things like, do you need end-to-end encryption? Can the encryption end within the VPC, for example? Do you need to see the source IP address of the source? Do you have east-west communication? Things like this. Ask all kinds of questions. And the port numbers, for example. And then once we have that, you get driven towards the architecture, right? Because there are different architectures. Each one of them have some pros and cons. And the architectures, usually they're different in the cloud. That's one of the things about cloud that is different, is that your north-south architecture, so basically how does traffic exit towards the internet and how does traffic enter, usually we might actually use completely different architectures. and different set of firewalls, which is recommended actually. So a lot of times you don't use the same firewalls for inbound traffic versus outbound. And that because a lot of times if you did that, the deployment might become much more complicated. Then once you did that, those requirements as far as do I need east-west, do I need outbound, what are my business application requirements, that kind of drives you towards one or two possible architectures. At that point, the organization basically needs to sit down all together if they have a security team. And then the question is, do I have now, I guess at the very beginning is also you need to see if you also have on-prem firewalls and do you have a requirement to keep the operational aspects of it consistent or not. So there are many ways you can approach this, but I always say get all the groups in and start with the application. And also you need to have the security team to see what is there already. And this goes to logging, this goes to SIEM, this goes to all the things that you need to integrate with. And once you have all those pieces, again, the architecture for inbound and outbound, you can come up with different architectures that meet your requirements. But once you have the requirements, usually you end up in an architecture because each one of them has some things that work better with them.
To summarize, start with your application requirements, and then whatever other issues are around that in terms of tools you have, tooling you need, visibility you need,
Exactly.
and that's going to sort of help you plot out what a reasonable design is based on those requirements.
Exactly.
And is that
Exactly.
something, so when you're planning the firewall and your CSP, does it make sense to figure that out early and have those conversations during the application architecture phase? Or is it the organization gets so far and then they start thinking through the firewall architecture before it's actually deployed? How important is it to do the firewall portion of the planning with the original architecture? Or do you need to kind of know what you're aiming for? And Jeff, maybe you're the best person to answer that.
Ideally, you would plan your inspection architecture at the time the application is designed. We don't frequently see that. Usually we are coming in at a later point to make some changes to meet security requirements.
That was a very politically correct answer, wasn't it?
Thanks.
And Jeff's soft voice there.
Also, just want to add one thing to what Amir said earlier about separate firewalls for outbound versus east-west. That really threw me at first because I was used to a data center environment where you had a perimeter firewall. And my thinking was, hey, this is just a way for vendors to sell us more firewalls. But really, it's not. Once you get to operating these things, the ability to scale outbound east-west versus inbound is very valuable. So that actually is a practice that we strongly recommend to our clients.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. I'm glad you expanded on that a little bit because that is definitely a different mindset, I think, for a lot of us.
Well, this does bring us to the end of the conversation. Amir, Jeff, any final thoughts before we conclude?
What I would say is that don't be afraid of cloud firewalls. When you read these reference architectures that vendors give you, or when you read the way AWS firewall is inserted into a data path, it could be intimidating. But there are many reasons why people need them. How do you protect outbound? How do you protect east-west? How do you come up with the same features that you have in a data center if you don't use that same kind of firewall? The second thing is that even before you start working on these firewalls and trying to get the people that in your company up to speed with cloud networking, especially if you go with an appliance approach, the feature set is going to be very similar as far as security feature set is going to be very similar to what you have in the data center. But what's going to get people is differences in networking. So the more they understand how cloud networking works, the easier it is to deploy this and later on troubleshoot if needed.
My closing thought is use automation. Some of these designs might have like 16, 17 route tables. You cannot configure this by hand. It's not Terraform is nice to have. Terraform or similar tool is a must.
Yeah, that's another whole topic we could probably get into, but we'll have to leave it for another day. Thanks, Amir, and thanks, Jeff from Konekti Systems for joining us to get into this complicated topic. I appreciate some of the clarity you brought. And thanks to you, the listener, for joining us for another episode of Packet Protector. If you've got a topic you want us to cover, you can find us on LinkedIn or at packetpushers.net/community, where you can join our free Slack channel and meet with other IT and security pros and connect with them. If you have a comment, a correction, or question, you can always reach out to us at packetpushers.net/FU. The FU is for follow-up, and we appreciate when listeners do contact us. As always, make sure to eat your security vegetables.